Hello, my wonderful third graders. I hope you're having a fantastic day. We are still studying colonial America. This is lesson 4, cash crops, the Carolinas, and slavery. Some vocabulary words you will hear throughout the read aloud. Cash crop is a large amount of produce grown to be sold to others to make money rather than to be used or eaten by the people growing it. Flourished is a verb and it means became successful, grew well, prospered, reached excellence. An indentured servant. Indentured servants are people who agree to work for a time, typically 7 years, in exchange for travel to the New World, in addition to lodging, clothing, and food. Indigo is a plant that produces a blue-colored dye that was valuable during the colonial period. Pivotal is an adjective. It describes something. It means critical, very important, because other things depend on it. Often refers to a turn of events or change of direction. Regard is attention or consideration. Slavery is the practice of forcing people to work without pay as enslaved people and denying them the freedom to decide how to live their lives. Transformed means to change shape, size, appearance, or quality. As you heard, John Rolfe is well known for marrying Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, also known as Matuaka, and for making Jamestown, and therefore Virginia, an important economic center. John Rolfe did this by growing and exporting tobacco and then shipping it out of the area to places that wanted to buy it. You might be thinking, yuck, tobacco means smoking, and we all know that is a very unhealthy habit. Even land-greedy King James thought so. He once said that smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. However, because many people still wanted tobacco and were willing to pay for it, tobacco became a huge part of the southern colonies' economy. The Spanish were the first to bring tobacco to Europe from the Americas. They had discovered that Native Americans in various parts of Central and South America used tobacco in a variety of ways. It was chewed, smoked, used as medicine, and was an important part of many religious ceremonies. In fact, when Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World, he was greeted by local natives carrying gifts of fruit, spears, and dried leaves that had a strong fragrance. Those leaves were tobacco. When the English arrived in North America, they too found that many Native Americans grew and used tobacco. The English settlers' get-rich plan had not succeeded when they failed to find gold. Some settlers had also experimented with growing crops such as rice and grapes, but they too were unsuccessful. However, John Rolfe, with the guidance of the Powhatan, made a pivotal contribution to the doomed Jamestown economy. Tobacco was used in peace pipes, which we discussed when we talked about Native Americans, as sacred objects used by Native Americans for various purposes. If something is pivotal, it means that it is a turning point. The word pivot means to turn, such as how a soccer player pivots quickly on one foot to change direction. Wealthy Europeans were beginning to develop a taste for tobacco. However, much of the tobacco being shipped to Europe had a bitter taste. John Rolfe introduced a new tobacco plant to the fields around Jamestown. He brought in a less bitter tasting plant from the West Indies. Well, actually, he brought in the seeds to see if they would grow. It was an experiment, but it worked. The new tobacco plants grew and flourished in the red Virginia soil, and so the milder tasting Virginia tobacco became much sought after. Its increased use among the growing number of English smokers transformed the colony's economy. Jamestown became a place of wealth and enterprise. Shiploads of Englishmen and women eagerly set off to make their fortune there. From this context, do you think flourished is a positive or a negative thing? It's a positive thing, right? It means something's doing really well. The gold that the early settlers had sought turned out to be in the form of an odorous plant. Odorous plant. Odor is a smell. Many people became wealthy as a result of growing this cash crop. No doubt if you had been there in Jamestown, you might have heard the sound of gold coins jingling in the colonists' pockets. Tobacco was so popular that by 1619 it had become Virginia's main crop. Within 50 years, the colony exported about 15 million pounds of it to Europe. Eventually, tobacco was such a widespread cash crop that the governor had to remind the settlers to grow food crops as well. With the success of the tobacco industry, the future of Jamestown was finally secured. Why do you think it is called a cash crop? Well, a cash crop is a large amount of produce. It's a crop that you grow to make money rather than to be used or eaten by those growing it. So if you were a tobacco farmer, you wouldn't necessarily smoke it. You might smoke tobacco. You shouldn't. But they did back then and didn't know how bad it was for you. But you made it to sell. Whereas, like, if you have a garden and you grow tomatoes, usually you keep those to eat. Those would not be a cash crop. 15 million would be about the same weight as 625 full-grown. I don't know what that says. I'm going to have to do this so I can see what it says. Hold on a second. Elephants! Oh, goodness. 15 million pounds of tobacco would be about the same weight as 625 full-grown elephants. My Lanta, that's crazy. It's a lot of elephants. And it's very heavy. However, there was one major drawback to growing tobacco. Back then, a lot of people were needed who were willing to work very, very hard to tend the large plantations, and people like that weren't easy to find. In the beginning, the new tobacco farmers had mostly indentured servants working for them. Indentured servants were people who had agreed to travel to Virginia and eventually to other parts of North America to work for a period of time for a specific person. Indentured servants were not paid money for their work. Instead, they worked in exchange for travel to the New World and for their lodgings, clothing, and food. The agreed upon period of time was usually 7 years. Often, these indentured servants were poor people from England or other parts of Europe whose ship passage was purchased for them by their employer. Then, as soon as they arrived at their new homes, the indentured servants were put to work. These indentured servants labored long and hard in the tobacco fields. After the agreed upon time of service was up, and if they were still alive after the hardships many of them endured, they were free to venture out on their own. So they didn't have to stay servants forever. They just worked off their years and they got their freedom. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with what it is believed to have been the first 20 Africans brought to North America. According to some historical accounts, these Africans were brought to North America as indentured servants, and they may have worked alongside white indentured servants. However, as the colony developed and there became a serious shortage of workers, colonists believed that the use of slavery was the most efficient way to manage plantations. Before long, thousands of Africans were brought to the colonies, against their will and forced to work. Why did this terrible transition take place? Well, because they needed more people to work, and they decided that that's what they would do, which is a horrible thing to do. Like other indentured servants, it is said that some of these African Americans and women, men and women, had been brought to the colony to work in exchange for travel expenses, lodging, and other necessary things, and then would eventually gain their freedom. But then they started getting slaves. Remember, the English had begun to lay claim to large areas of North America. After all, the Spanish were claiming most of Central and South America, and even parts of southern North America as their own, and the French had claimed much of northern North America. The English thought it was only fair that they claim huge chunks of land too. As you recall, England's very first attempt to colonize North America on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina failed and became known as the Lost Colony. But in 1663, Charles II, the son of Charles I and grandson of King James I, decided to try again near the same area. Charles II eagerly gave a charter or official document to 8 of his friends that stated that the land between Virginia and the Spanish colony of Florida now belonged to him, well, to England, to be precise. Today, this land is North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, although Georgia was not officially colonized until much later. Charles II also named part of this land after himself. Carolina means of Charles. This charter was extended in 1665, and more land was divided up among his friends to manage. So, King Charles II thought he was in charge of everything, I guess, and decided, hey, I'm just going to give that land over there that nobody owns. I guess I'm going to take it and give it to my buddies. Charles II was particularly generous to those who had helped his family when his father, Charles I, was killed. At that time, Charles II had been forced to flee to another country. When Charles II was eventually allowed to return to England and take the throne, he owed a great deal of money to a great many people. His way out of debt was to give them North America. Well, part of it anyway. Having heard how successful Jamestown was, hundreds and then thousands of English flocked to the South and to the Carolinas in particular. In 1670, a busy seaport was established called Charlestown. I'm sure you can guess who Charlestown was named after. Who was living in North America when Charles II was giving part of it away? The Native Americans. Whereas some English thought Charles II was very clever, some people in North America experienced life-changing events because of this and other decisions. So if you look at Charlestown on the map, it's right down here. It is now known as Charleston. So if you've ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, it used to be Charlestown, and it's named after King Charles. You can see it's in the southern region. In the beginning, many colonists in the Carolinas established small farms. Before long, large plantations replaced small farms for the purpose of growing cash crops. The top 3 cash crops in this area during this time were rice, tobacco, and indigo. Indigo is a plant used to make a beautiful blue dye. It was brought to South Carolina from the West Indies by a young woman named Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Similar to how John Rolfe experimented with types of tobacco seeds, Pinckney experimented with types of indigo until she was able to make a superior valuable dye. The warm climate and marshy stretches of land with fewer trees in the Carolinas were perfect for growing rice and indigo, whereas tobacco thrived in certain parts of North Carolina. With drier land and more trees, the geography and climate of Virginia was not conducive to growing rice and indigo. Tobacco was the only cash crop in Jamestown. As in Virginia, it soon became clear that there was a lot of money to be made in the Carolinas by growing crops. Many more workers were needed. Unfortunately, the solution the colonists chose was the extensive use of slavery. As you can imagine, no one volunteers to be enslaved. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans did not come to North America of their own free will as part of an exchange agreement, nor did they have any hope of ever being set free. Instead, they were taken by force. They were kidnapped. The roots of slavery go deep into the past. Throughout history, powerful people have enslaved less powerful people. Although England began trading enslaved Africans later than some other European countries, it soon became one of the biggest slave trading countries due to the widespread use of slavery in the English colonies. What are some groups of people that we've learned about already who enslaved others? The ancient Greeks and Romans, the Vikings, and some European explorers. It's still a horrible thing that happens today. It's so sad. For England, the African slave trade was part of a larger trade network among Europe, West Africa, and North America, including the colonies and the West Indies. Some of these trade routes became known as triangular trade routes. If you look at the map, you will see why. Through these triangular trade networks, certain goods were traded for other much needed items. Enslaved Africans were part of the network too. A network is a system of interconnected things such as the road systems in ancient Rome and the systems of the human body. So you can see the trade route. So tobacco, rice, timber, grain would come from North America to England. England would send over tools, clothing, other manufactured goods to North America. North America would send iron products to Africa. In Africa, people would go over to Africa and kidnap African people and bring them back as slaves, unfortunately. In this illustration, you can see how horribly the African people were taken. Their villages were attacked and they were taken out of their villages, tied up and put on ships. A lot of them died on the ships on the way over. English ships laden with iron products, especially guns, arrived in the West African ports to trade their goods for slaves and gold. Africans who became enslaved had previously lived freely in Africa, but became victims of kidnapping by slave raiders. Many of these raiders were Africans armed with guns supplied by European slave traders. Enslaved Africans were considered to be valuable workers. Captured Africans were loaded onto ships destined for parts of North America. This trade route from West Africa to North America became known as the Middle Passage. If the West Indies was their final destination, enslaved Africans were exchanged for goods such as molasses and sugar that were then transported to the southern colonies. Many others stayed on the ship and were taken to the colonies along with the goods. Although there were enslaved Africans in all parts of the 13 English colonies, most enslaved Africans were sent to the South. This was because most farmers in the Middle Atlantic and New England regions were smaller and more easily maintained by families. However, some enslaved Africans in the cities worked in homes and shops as servants or as skilled artisans or craftsmen. It's a really sad illustration of what it would have been like to be on a slave ship coming over from Africa. People were stuffed together. A lot of people, and this is men, women, and children, a lot of people died on the way over because they were horribly treated on the ships. And it's such a terrible thing that was done. The businesses of enslaving and shipping captured African men, women, and children was a gruesome or horrible one. Captured Africans were packed like cargo onto ships where there was hardly enough room to move. Many were chained together or to parts of the ship. Very little food and water was provided, and the conditions were extremely unsanitary. There was usually no medical assistance for those who became sick. The journey itself could take 6 to 10 weeks to complete. The Africans had no idea where they were going or if they would survive the journey. Although enslaved Africans were valued for their labor, the traders believed that there was an endless supply of these workers. Therefore, if some died along the way, the traders thought they could easily be replaced. Many captured Africans died before they even reached the Americas. When those who did survive reached shore, they were marched off the ship in chains to to be examined by prospective buyers and then sold at auctions. There was little regard for the humanity of these African men, women, and children. The main objective was to put them to work on plantations to make a lot of money for the Europeans. I just want to say this is a horrible part of our history, but it's something that happened and we need to remember it and we need to learn from it. We need to learn that all people are created equal and that we need to do everything we can to make sure that there is equality where we are in our families, in our community, in our school, in our workplaces. It's very important. Although it would take more than 100 years and the very long and difficult U.S. Civil War, eventually slavery came to an end in the United States. But it does happen in other countries and illegally in many, many places throughout the world. They say there's more slaves now than there were back then. Which region did you hear about in today's read aloud? The southern region. Which colonies did you hear about as part of this region? North and South Carolina. Who was the grandson of King James I who gave this land to his friends by a charter? Charles II. Did this land really belong to him? No. Which city in South Carolina is named after Charles I? Charleston, or Charlestown, as it used to be called. Which cash crop became very successful in the Carolinas? Rice, indigo, and tobacco. Which of these three was the only cash crop that would grow in Virginia? Tobacco. Compare and contrast the geography, climate, and crops of the Carolinas and Virginia. Some similarities: all are in the southern region, so they are generally warm and good for crops such as tobacco. Some differences: it is warmer and swampier in the Carolinas, which is better for growing rice and indigo. There are more trees and fewer swamps in Virginia, and land is not good for growing indigo or rice. Describe what you see in this image. How was exporting tobacco a pivotal or turning point for the colonists? The colonists, with guidance from the Powhatan and John Rolfe, were able to grow a very valuable crop that many people wanted. Jamestown transformed from a struggling, failing colony to one that flourished. What were some of the challenges and negative aspects of growing tobacco? It took a lot of people, which led to the expansion of slavery. It was very hard work. What decisions did the colonists make to try to solve these problems? They used indentured servants for the labor and then enslaved African people. What year were the first known African laborers brought to the English colonies? 1619. Were the first Africans brought to Jamestown believed to have been indentured servants or enslaved laborers? The first ones were indentured servants, which means they could have worked for a time to get their freedom. Which areas were included in this triangular trade network? Europe, West Africa, and North America, including the West Indies. Which part of this trade network was the Middle Passage? The route between West Africa and North America, where the African people were sent as slaves on ships. Our word for the day is transformed. In the read aloud, you heard tobacco's increased use among the growing number of English smokers transformed the colony's economy. Say the word transformed. Transformed means profoundly changed in form, shape, size, appearance, attitude, or in another way. When the princess kissed the frog, it suddenly transformed into a prince. Okay, do not forget to fill out your graphic organizer about North and South Carolina. You may do one for both North and South Carolina together. Tell me their industry, which includes their crops. What was the climate like? Remember, it's in the southern region. May include some of the important dates that you learned. Why did people go there? What was their motivation for what they did? The major city, you can put Charleston or Charlestown. Some interesting details you learned and something that you would like to research more. All right, third graders, we've learned about some really hard topics today. Please let me know if you have any questions or anything you would like to say about it during our afternoon wrap up.